Men did not come to a geisha only for beauty. If beauty had been enough, any pretty face could have done the job. But that was never the real power of a geisha. What men came for was harder to name. They came for the feeling of being noticed, understood, admired, and handled with such precision that they often mistook the experience for intimacy. Aki understood that very early. By the time she was fully trained, she knew that a room could be guided without raising a voice. A man could be softened without being corrected. His pride could be fed without looking obvious. His loneliness could be touched without ever being fully answered. That was the real art. Not simply entertaining men, but reading them fast enough to know what they wanted from the room before they knew how to ask for it. In the world of the geisha, this was a form of power. Aki had no official authority. She held no title, commanded no household, and could not order powerful men to do anything. Yet inside the rooms where men drank, boasted, competed, and quietly revealed themselves, she learned how to guide tone, redirect tension, and shape the emotional rhythm of the evening. She could make one man feel clever, another feel respected, and a third feel gently restrained without any of them fully noticing how much of the room had already passed into her hands. That is why the geisha was often misunderstood. People looking from the outside saw music, silk, and beauty. They imagined performance. What they did not see was the sharper skill beneath it. The ability to read male vanity, insecurity, desire, boredom, and loneliness almost at a glance, and then respond in exactly the way that kept the room balanced. Aki was trained to do all of that. She learned how to tell when a man wanted admiration more than truth, when he wanted to be listened to more than answered, and when his ego had to be handled carefully before it turned into embarrassment or aggression. She learned that the most effective control was the kind that did not look like control at all. It looked like charm. It looked like tact. It looked like grace. And that is where this story begins. Not with romance, and not with the fantasy men liked to project onto women like Aki, but with the hidden intelligence behind the geisha's charm. The art of reading men, guiding them, and sometimes controlling the entire emotional climate of a room without ever appearing to do so. Before Aki learned how to influence a room, she learned how to watch it. That lesson began long before she was important enough to sit near the center of any gathering. In her early years, she stood at the edges. She poured, carried, waited, and listened. Men often paid no attention to girls at that stage, which gave her a strange advantage. She could study them before they ever thought to study her. She began with the obvious things: how a man sat, how quickly he drank, whether he looked around the room like someone expecting to be admired, or kept his eyes low like someone who needed to be drawn out, whether his laughter came easily or arrived a little too loudly, as if it were covering something, whether he interrupted others, watched others, tested others, or tried too hard to appear above everyone else in the room. None of this was written down for her. It was learned the old way, by watching older women handle men without seeming to handle them at all. Aki saw how a geisha could let one man talk longer because he needed to hear himself, while quietly turning the room back toward another man before resentment had time to grow. She saw how a boast could be softened with the right smile, how a foolish remark could be saved from embarrassment if someone answered it lightly enough, and how silence itself could be used to make a guest lean forward, eager to fill it. That was when she began to understand something important. Men did not all want the same thing from a geisha. Some wanted admiration, some wanted ease, some wanted to feel clever, some wanted to feel younger than they were, more powerful than they were, more desired than they had any right to expect. A few wanted genuine conversation, but even then, what they often wanted most was the feeling that someone had understood them without making them struggle to be understood. Aki learned to recognize these differences quickly. A man with too much pride could not be corrected directly. He had to be guided. A lonely man needed attention, but not too much, or he might begin to mistake courtesy for promise. A drunk man had to be steadied before he lost his own sense of proportion. A competitive man needed just enough approval to relax, but never so much that he became unbearable. Every room required adjustment, and every man inside it carried his own private weakness. This was not romance, it was reading, and it was done at speed. By the time Aki was older, she could often tell within minutes what kind of evening a man wanted, what kind of version of himself he hoped to become inside that room, and how fragile that version really was. She could see when a man wanted to be admired more than answered. She could feel when his confidence was real, and when it was only performance. She learned that male pride was rarely as solid as it looked. Often it was something that had to be kept from cracking in public. That knowledge gave her power, but not the kind men usually respected openly. She could not order them. She could not shame them. She could not challenge them the way another powerful man might. But she could guide how they felt. She could steer what they noticed. She could decide where warmth would fall, where tension would be softened, where attention would briefly rest, and where it would quietly move away. Aki was learning that influence did not always belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it belonged to the person who understood what everyone else needed before they understood it themselves. And in that world, the men rarely noticed how much they were revealing. They believed they were choosing the mood of the evening. In truth, women like Aki were often shaping it around them, moment by moment, with a level of care and calculation that remained almost invisible precisely because it was so refined. That was the beginning of her real education. Not just how to entertain men, but how to read them well enough to know where their vanity ended, where their loneliness began, and how to touch one without disturbing the other. The more Aki watched men, the more clearly she began to see that pride sat very close to vulnerability. It was not always obvious at first. In fact, it often hid itself behind the very things meant to conceal it: confidence, loudness, authority, wit, even charm. A man could enter a room looking perfectly at ease and still be waiting, almost from the first moment, for someone to confirm the version of himself he wanted others to believe in. Aki learned to notice that need quickly. Some men wanted to be seen as intelligent. They did not necessarily need to be contradicted less. They needed to feel that their thoughts had weight in the room. Others wanted to be seen as generous, experienced, or worldly. Some wanted the reassurance that they still carried presence, that they had not become invisible with age, routine, or disappointment. Even the most powerful men often arrived with some private insecurity tucked beneath the surface of their ease. This was where Aki's skill sharpened. She understood that a man's pride was rarely strengthened by direct praise alone. Too much praise felt cheap. Too obvious an effort to flatter could make a room turn false. What worked better was something more precise. The right amount of agreement, the right kind of question, the right pause before a reply, the subtle sense that what he had just said was worth receiving seriously. That was often all he needed. Not truth, not intimacy, not even admiration in the deepest sense. Only the feeling that he had landed well in the mind of someone he wanted to impress. Aki knew how to give that feeling without surrendering too much of herself in the process. If a man was speaking too grandly, she did not embarrass him by cutting the boast apart. She let it breathe just enough to preserve his dignity, then shifted the room elsewhere before the performance could become ridiculous. If he was seeking approval, she could give him a version of it that felt natural rather than fed to him. If he was trying too hard to dominate, she knew how to soften his edge without openly opposing him, which was often the only kind of correction a man like that would accept. This was not kindness in the simple sense. It was management. Aki was learning that male pride did not always need to be inflated. Very often it needed to be handled. There was a difference. A fragile ego could make a room heavy. A bruised ego could make it unpleasant. A proud man who felt ignored might become louder, meaner, or more childish with every cup. So part of her work was to keep those shifts from happening too openly. She was not there to worship him. She was there to make him easier to be around. That required precision. Too much attention, and a man might mistake performance for personal feeling. Too little, and he might begin resenting the room itself. Aki had to find the exact point at which a man felt seen without becoming emboldened, affirmed without becoming intolerable, special, without forgetting that he was still inside a structured world he did not control entirely. This was where many people misunderstood geisha most deeply. From the outside, it could look as though women like Aki were simply pleasing men. In truth, the work was much sharper than that. She was not merely agreeing, smiling, and nodding. She was regulating. She was deciding when a man needed to be allowed his illusion, when that illusion needed softening, and when the room had to be protected from it before everyone else began paying the price. Aki also understood something many men did not. Pride often had less to do with strength than with fear. A man who boasted too much was often afraid of seeming small. A man who demanded attention was often afraid of losing it. A man who pushed too far sometimes did so because he could not bear the possibility of not mattering. The more Aki saw of these rooms, the more she realized that many men did not come only to be entertained. They came to be reassured that they were still interesting, still worthy of notice, still capable of holding the gaze of someone trained to observe them closely. That was why a geisha's attention could feel so powerful. It was not casual attention. It was focused, measured, and skilled. A man sitting across from Aki might feel, for a brief time, that he had become the most readable person in the room, and also the most safely received. He might walk away believing he had impressed her, when what had really happened was that she had understood exactly what kind of recognition he needed and had given him just enough of it to keep the evening smooth. This is where the line between charm and control became so thin. Aki was not hypnotizing men. She was not overpowering them. What she was doing was more subtle, and in some ways, more effective. She was entering the emotional structure of their pride and learning how to move around inside it without causing damage unless damage was unavoidable. That gave her a kind of influence that did not look like power, because it was never announced as power. It appeared as tact, as grace, as the natural ease of a woman who somehow always knew the right thing to say. But Aki knew better. The right thing was rarely obvious. It had to be sensed, and it changed from man to man. By the time Aki understood how men protected their pride, she had begun to see something even larger. The real stage was never just the dance floor. It was the room itself. From the outside, people tended to focus on the visible arts, the shamisen, the dance, the silk, the polished etiquette. Those things mattered, of course, and they were part of what made the geisha world so distinct. But Aki learned that the deeper skill was not simply performing in front of men. It was shaping the atmosphere around them, while making that shaping feel invisible. That was much harder. A room was never still, even when no one was speaking. Status moved through it. Rivalries moved through it. Vanity, boredom, drunkenness, insecurity, and desire moved through it too. A guest who looked relaxed might already be growing irritated. Another might be waiting for the right moment to boast. Another might have drunk just enough to become sentimental, or foolish, or dangerous. Aki had to feel these shifts early, often before anyone else in the room admitted they were happening. That was why a geisha could never truly relax inside her own work. She had to stay aware of more than her own performance. She had to sense what kind of rhythm the evening was taking on. Was the room growing too stiff, too loud, too competitive, too intimate? Was one man speaking too much while another was quietly disappearing? Was the laughter still genuine, or had it started to cover discomfort? Was someone becoming reckless? Was someone about to lose face? Aki learned that every room had to be managed differently. Some rooms needed warming, some needed softening, some needed containing, some only needed the right silence in the right place. That was part of the art. She was not simply reacting to whatever happened. She was often guiding what happened next. A question asked at the right moment could redirect attention. A slight turn of the body could include or exclude without anyone naming it. A small laugh, if placed correctly, could rescue a failed remark before it became a humiliation. A pause, if held with confidence, could make people lean toward her rather than away from one another. This was where Aki's training became something finer than performance. She was learning how to shape tone, and tone once shaped everything else. A room with the wrong tone could become coarse, brittle, exhausting, or unsafe. A room with the right tone allowed men to feel at ease without becoming unruly, important without becoming unbearable, noticed without turning needy. It was not that Aki controlled every person in front of her. That would have been impossible. What she could control, at least for a while, was the emotional weather they moved inside. That was more powerful than most people realized, and it rarely looked dramatic. To an outsider, nothing special might seem to be happening. Aki would pour a drink, tilt her head slightly, answer one man lightly, then turn to another before the balance of attention grew dangerous. She might shift a conversation just before someone said too much. She might give one guest enough warmth to steady him, while cooling another with the smallest increase in formality. None of this announced itself as control. It looked like grace. It looked like social ease. It looked like a woman moving through a room with natural tact. But Aki knew how much thought lived underneath that surface. She knew when a room had started hardening around one man's ego. She knew when someone needed to be given room to shine, and when that same man needed to be gently led away from the center before he made himself ridiculous. She knew that men often revealed themselves most clearly not in what they said, but in how they responded to attention. Who relaxed under it, who demanded more of it, who became greedy, who became tender, and who became careless the moment they believed the room belonged to them. This was why her real work was never only with individuals. It was with currents. She had to sense where the room wanted to drift and decide whether that drift could be allowed. Sometimes the answer was yes. Some evenings needed a little looseness. Some men needed to talk too long before they could settle. Some pauses had to be endured rather than fixed. But often, Aki had to intervene before the shape of the evening turned against itself. That intervention was part of what made Geisha so difficult to understand from outside the room. People assumed the performance was the point. In truth, the performance was often only the visible frame. Inside that frame, a woman like Aki was making constant calculations. She was distributing attention, protecting dignity, cooling friction, feeding certain illusions and denying others. She was deciding, moment by moment, how much warmth the room could hold and how much danger it might invite if left unattended. And she had to do all of this while seeming unforced. That was the hardest part. Aki could not look calculating. She could not let the room feel managed too obviously. Men who wanted to feel powerful did not enjoy being made aware that someone else had already taken hold of the emotional structure around them. So the control had to remain soft. It had to pass through charm, timing, and the appearance of ease. That was what made it so refined. And that was why the room, not the stage, became her real field of power. Aki did not learn charm only to please men. She learned it to survive them. This was one of the hardest truths hidden inside the geisha world. From the outside, charm looked soft. It looked decorative, even effortless. A smile, a lowered voice, a well-timed laugh, a graceful turn of the wrist. To many men, these things felt natural, almost instinctive, as though women like Aki simply moved through the world in that way. But for Aki, charm was never only sweetness. Very often it was a defense, because she could not respond to men the way a man might. She could not openly embarrass them when they became too familiar. She could not challenge them too directly without risking the mood of the room or her own safety inside it. She could not let irritation show too plainly, even when a guest had crossed a line in tone, in assumption, or in the amount of access he believed himself entitled to. The room demanded smoothness, and smoothness had to be maintained even when the pressure underneath it was not smooth at all. That was where charm became a weapon of another kind. Aki learned how to refuse without making refusal look like refusal. A shifted subject could cool a man's confidence faster than a sharp answer. A small increase in formality could create distance without inviting open conflict. A laugh, if used carefully, could turn a presumptuous remark into something lighter and less dangerous than it might otherwise have become. Sometimes the safest answer was not resistance in the obvious sense, but redirection, moving the moment somewhere else before a man had time to feel denied. This required constant judgment. Aki had to know what kind of man sat in front of her. Some would accept subtlety. Some needed to be handled more delicately because their pride bruised easily. Some became cruder the more comfortable they felt. Some tested boundaries not because they truly wanted intimacy, but because they wanted proof that the room still belonged to them. Aki could not afford to misread that too often. Her safety depended as much on interpretation as on composure. That is why her charm had edges, even when those edges could not be seen. A warm answer might protect her. A gentle joke might protect her. A perfectly timed interruption might protect her. Even attention itself could be used defensively, given in one direction so that it denied something in another. Sometimes keeping a man from becoming dangerous meant making him feel he had not been challenged, even while guiding him away from the direction he had wanted to take. None of this was simple, and none of it was free, because the more skilled Aki became at protecting herself through grace, the harder it sometimes became to separate grace from vigilance. She had to stay alert not only to the room in general, but to the way one man's mood could suddenly change the entire texture of an evening. A geisha might be admired, but admiration did not make her safe. Often it only made men feel more entitled to her attention, more confident in their interpretations, and more willing to believe that the softness she performed for the room belonged personally to them. Aki learned very early that this was one of the central dangers of her profession. Men often misunderstood control when it came wrapped in beauty. They assumed that because she smiled, she was open. Because she listened, she was yielding. Because she made things easier, she existed to be approached more closely. But Aki knew that ease was part of the performance, not an invitation to step beyond it. She had to know how to preserve that boundary without turning the preservation itself into a public scene. That was why so much of her power remained invisible. She did not protect herself by becoming hard in obvious ways. Hardness would have broken the role she was expected to inhabit. Instead, she learned a softer strength, one built from timing, indirection, alertness, and the ability to move a man emotionally without letting him feel that he had been moved at all. If he felt gently guided, he might follow. If he felt denied, he might resist. Aki's task was to know the difference before the room paid for it. This made her seem to some men naturally tactful. In reality, she was often working much harder than they understood. What looked like charm was frequently labor under pressure. What looked like feminine ease was sometimes careful self-preservation. What looked like emotional generosity could, in practice, be a way of staying one step ahead of male entitlement, before entitlement sharpened into something uglier. That is why the geisha's softness should never be mistaken for passivity. In Aki's case, softness was often strategy. It allowed her to remain inside the form expected of her while still protecting something of herself from being taken too easily. She could not always control what men imagined, but she could often control the direction in which those imaginations moved. And in rooms full of male pride, alcohol, rank, and unspoken competition, that was no small skill. By then, Aki understood something that many men in those rooms never did. Charm was not merely what made her appealing. It was part of what kept her intact. Most men who came to a geisha believed they understood what they were paying for. They thought they were paying for beauty, refinement, music, conversation, and the rare pleasure of being in the company of a woman trained to make an evening feel smoother than ordinary life ever did. None of that was entirely wrong. Aki knew very well that appearance mattered, that skill mattered, that the room itself depended on a certain kind of polish. But she also understood something many of the men around her never fully grasped. What they wanted was not only what they saw. Very often, what they wanted most was a feeling. Some wanted to feel intelligent, not merely listened to, but received as though their words deserved real attention. Some wanted to feel admired, without having to earn admiration too honestly. Some wanted relief from the coarseness of business, rivalry, obligation, and public life. Some wanted to feel younger than they were, more interesting than they were, more desired than they had any right to expect. A few wanted the illusion of intimacy so carefully arranged that it never had to bear the burden of real mutuality. Aki learned to recognize these desires almost as quickly as she recognized a face. She could tell when a man wanted to talk about himself, and when he wanted someone to spare him from doing so too openly. She could tell when what looked like confidence was really hunger for validation. She could tell when a patron wanted not simply entertainment, but the comfort of being reflected back to himself in a flattering shape. That was often the real purchase taking place in the room. Not the woman, not the conversation alone, but the version of himself he was allowed to become while sitting across from her. This is why so many men left a geisha's company believing they had been understood more deeply than they actually had been. Aki did understand them, but not always in the way they imagined. She understood the structure of what they needed. She understood where pride was fragile, where loneliness had begun to harden into habit, where boredom had become arrogance, and where desire had less to do with passion than with reassurance. She knew how to make a man feel more settled inside himself for the length of an evening, and that temporary settling could feel, to him, almost like revelation. That was part of the art, and part of the deception, though not in the cheap sense of the word. Aki was not usually lying to men outright. She was giving them something carefully measured, something just convincing enough to feel personal, while remaining governed by form. The warmth was real, but limited. The attention was real, but disciplined. The interest might be real in the moment, but it did not belong to the man in the way he often wanted to believe it did. That difference was everything, and yet it was exactly what many of them failed to perceive. Men often thought they were buying access to the woman herself. In reality, what they were buying was her trained presence. They were buying her ability to listen without exposing too much of herself, her ability to make them feel singular without surrendering her boundaries, her ability to create a room in which their vanity could breathe without becoming grotesque. Their loneliness could be touched without becoming a demand, and their need for admiration could be fed without ever being named too plainly. Aki understood that this was what made the profession so powerful and so dangerous. Powerful, because she could shape how a man felt about himself without ever needing to command him directly. Dangerous, because men who felt deeply seen often wanted to believe they had seen her too. That misunderstanding could cling to them. A man might leave thinking he had made a true impression, when what he had really encountered was an extraordinary form of professional attention. He might believe he had been chosen, when in fact he had simply been handled with unusual intelligence. He might call the feeling affection. Aki knew that much of the time it was closer to comfort, vanity, and the relief of having one's ego carried gently for a while. This did not make the experience meaningless. That is important. The emotional exchange in such rooms was not fake in the simple sense. Men felt what they felt. Aki felt things too, though not always what they imagined. The room had real atmosphere. The conversation could be genuinely good. Laughter could be genuine. So could tenderness, in fleeting forms. But the structure beneath it remained what it was. A geisha's role was to make the moment feel fuller than ordinary life, not to dissolve the boundaries that made the moment possible in the first place. Aki had to remember that even when the men around her preferred not to. That was part of why the work could become so exhausting. She was constantly managing the gap between what a man thought he was receiving and what she was actually trained to give. Too much distance, and the room would grow cold. Too much warmth, and illusion could harden into expectation. She had to stay inside that narrow band, where the experience felt intimate enough to satisfy, but never so open that it became unmanageable. This was another reason beauty alone was never enough. A beautiful woman might attract attention. She might even hold it for a while. But what Aki had been trained to offer was more exact than attention. She offered emotional calibration. A room shaped to suit male needs without surrendering entirely to them. A version of closeness that could be entered, enjoyed, and left behind with a certain elegance, at least when things went well. And that was what many men were truly paying for, whether they realized it or not. Not just the painted face, the graceful hands, or the practiced arts, but the chance to sit inside a carefully arranged emotional world where they could feel larger, calmer, wiser, more desirable, or simply less alone than they did elsewhere. For men, the evening often ended when they stood up and left the room. For Aki, the work did not end so cleanly. That was part of the cost. By the time she had become skilled enough to read men quickly, guide their moods, and keep a room balanced without making the effort visible, those abilities no longer belonged only to the room. They had begun to settle into her more deeply than that. Observation had become habit. Restraint had become habit. So had the instinct to measure what she revealed, to calculate how a gesture might be read, to notice the moment when admiration was beginning to turn into expectation. The training made her powerful in certain ways. It also made rest harder. Aki could not simply sit among people and be unguarded. Not easily. She had spent too many years learning how to hold a room together, how to protect herself without offense, how to answer without giving too much away, how to shape the emotional weather of an evening while looking as though she were merely moving gracefully through it. Those habits did not always loosen when the guests were gone. Some remained in the body, in the face, in the timing of her silence. That was one of the lonelier parts of the profession. The geisha's art depended on making others feel seen, while revealing only a measured portion of the self in return. Aki could give attention, warmth, tact, charm, and relief. She could make a man feel more settled inside himself. She could make him believe for a little while that the room had become gentler around him. But the better she became at that art, the more carefully she had to guard the boundary between what she offered and what remained her own. That boundary cost energy. It cost spontaneity. It cost the luxury of not thinking. And it cost something else too, the right to be simple in the presence of other people. Aki had learned to read male pride before it bruised, male loneliness before it turned possessive, male desire before it mistook attention for permission. That knowledge protected her, but it also meant she moved through the world with a kind of constant awareness that many of the men around her never had to develop. They came to her for relief. She had to remain alert enough to provide that relief without letting it consume her. There was strain in that. not always dramatic strain. Often it was quieter than that. It lived in the body after long evenings, in the effort of holding the face open but not too open, warm but not yielding, composed even when tired. It lived in the mind too, in the constant adjustment, the constant reading, the constant sense of what might be said, what should not be said, and how quickly the emotional shape of a room could change if someone felt slighted, emboldened, or misled. And then there was the deeper cost, the way the role could begin to press against the self. Men often believed they were seeing the woman herself. Aki knew that what they were really seeing was something more selective, more disciplined, and more professionally arranged than they understood. Yet when one spends years offering a highly controlled version of warmth, attention, and grace, the division between role and self can grow difficult to manage even from the inside. She had to know where the performance ended, because others often preferred to believe it did not end at all. That, too, was tiring. A woman like Aki was admired, but admiration did not necessarily bring freedom. It brought expectations, it brought projections. It brought men who wanted to believe they had reached something personal in her, when in fact they had only reached the edge of what her training allowed them to feel. The more moving the illusion, the more carefully she had to preserve that edge. And she paid for that preservation with youth as well. Not only because youth passed, which it does for everyone, but because hers had been spent in discipline, refinement, vigilance, and the careful management of other people's emotional needs. By the time many men looked at her and saw accomplished femininity, much of the ordinary freedom of being young had already been used up in the making of it. This is what makes the geisha's power so complicated. Aki was not powerless, far from it. She knew how to influence a room, how to guide men without openly confronting them, how to move through pride, boredom, vanity, and loneliness with uncommon intelligence. She possessed form of social power many people around her did not fully understand, but the existence of that power did not erase the system she lived inside. It did not erase the physical demands, the emotional discipline, or the fact that much of what made her effective depended on offering men a carefully managed world in which they could continue to feel like themselves. That is why the story should not be reduced too easily in either direction. Aki was not merely manipulating men, and she was not merely serving them either. She lived in the narrow, difficult space between those truths. She learned to use what was available to her: beauty, timing, perception, tact, and emotional control, to shape the room around men who often had more formal power than she did. But everything she used came at a price. The charm that protected her demanded labor. The insight that gave her influence demanded vigilance. The refinement that made her unforgettable demanded years of self-discipline that others were free to romanticize precisely because they did not have to endure it. In the end, that may be the clearest way to understand what men received from a geisha and what the geisha herself had to give. Men received the illusion of ease. Aki carried the work that created it, and the more perfectly she carried it, the less visible that work became. Aki never held power in the way men did. No title was attached to her name. No formal authority sat behind her voice. She did not issue commands, settle disputes, sign decisions, or leave behind the kind of record history usually preserves. If someone had looked only at rank, law, or public office, they might have concluded that women like her stood at the edge of power rather than inside it. But rooms tell a different story than records do. Inside those rooms, Aki could shape the emotional direction of an evening more effectively than many of the men who believed themselves to be in control of it. She could soften arrogance, interrupt vanity without open insult, turn embarrassment into laughter, redirect hostility before it settled, and give a man just enough of what he needed to keep him from becoming intolerable to everyone around him. She could not command him in any official sense, yet she could influence how he felt, how he behaved, and sometimes even how he remembered himself afterward. That kind of power is easy to overlook because it leaves so little visible trace. It does not appear in decrees or records. It appears in altered moods, avoided conflicts, preserved dignity, softened tempers, and conversations that might have turned ugly but did not. It exists in the shape of what did not happen because someone like Aki had already stepped in quietly enough to prevent it. This is one reason geisha are still so often misunderstood. People tend to recognize power only when it looks masculine, direct, named, public, and backed by position. What Aki practiced belonged to another category. Her influence passed through tone, timing, perception, and a highly disciplined understanding of human weakness. She worked not above men, and not exactly below them either, but around them, moving through the spaces their pride, loneliness, and desire created. That is why the phrase controlling men's minds is both too simple and not entirely wrong. Aki was not controlling men in the crude sense. She was not breaking their will or bending them like puppets. What she did was subtler. She understood how a man wanted to be seen, what he feared feeling in public, and what kind of emotional arrangement would make him easier to guide. She entered the room through his ego, his insecurity, his need for ease, and from there she could influence far more than he realized. And yet, for all that, the limits remained. She could guide a man, but she could not rewrite the world that protected him. She could preserve a room, but not abolish the structures that made her labor necessary. She could create an atmosphere in which men behaved more gently, more elegantly, more intelligently than they otherwise might have. But that atmosphere lasted only as long as the room did. When the evening ended, the deeper order of things remained. That tension is what gives her power its strange character. It was real but temporary, effective but informal, intelligent but unrecognized in the terms history usually respects. Aki's life shows that women in such worlds were not without agency, but their agency often had to move through forms that looked like softness, service, charm, and beauty. What made that agency easy to dismiss was often exactly what made it possible. She could do what she did because the room underestimated the sharpness beneath the grace. That may be the final irony of it all. Men came to women like Aki believing they understood the terms of the exchange. They believed they were choosing the atmosphere, consuming the beauty, receiving the attention. Often they did not realize how much of the room had already been shaped around them by someone they had mistaken for ornament. Aki understood that better than they did. She knew that a room full of powerful men could still be emotionally fragile. She knew that vanity could be redirected, that loneliness could be softened, that aggression could sometimes be delayed or reduced by the right use of warmth, distance, humor, or silence. She knew how much of masculine self-assurance depended on being handled correctly, and she learned how to do that handling so well that it rarely looked like control at all. In that sense, the geisha's greatest art may not have been beauty, music, or even charm. It may have been the ability to move through male power without formally possessing it, and to shape male feeling without ever needing to name what she was doing. That kind of power is hard to record. But it is not hard to imagine once you understand the room. In the end, Aki did not master men in the dramatic way people like to imagine. She mastered something harder and in some ways more fragile. She learned how to enter a room full of male pride, loneliness, appetite, and performance without being swallowed by it. She learned how to read what men wanted before they said it plainly, how to give just enough to steady them, and how to keep the evening from tipping into something cruder, harsher, or more dangerous. She learned how to make influence look like ease, how to make self-protection look like grace, and how to turn attention itself into a tool she could guide rather than simply receive. That was her real art. Not seduction in the simple sense, not manipulation in the cheap sense, but the disciplined ability to shape emotional space without ever seeming to seize control of it. Men came to women like Aki, believing they were purchasing beauty, entertainment, or perhaps the illusion of intimacy. What many of them were really seeking was a more flattering version of themselves. They wanted to feel admired without being tested too honestly, desired without being exposed too clearly, understood without having to say too much about what sat underneath their pride. Aki knew this. She knew how much of male self-assurance depended on being received in the right way, and she learned how to provide that reception so skillfully that it felt natural. But natural was the last thing it was. Everything that looked effortless in Aki had been trained. The way she listened, the way she paused, the way she protected a man's dignity while quietly protecting her own. The way she moved attention through a room without making the movement obvious. Even her softness had structure in it. Even her warmth had edges. That is why the geisha should never be understood as a decorative figure alone. A woman like Aki was not simply beautiful. She was highly educated in mood, timing, tone, pride, and vulnerability. She understood that men could often be led more easily through ego than through argument, and that a room could be controlled more effectively through atmosphere than through command. She had no official power, but she developed the kind of intelligence that power itself often relies on while pretending not to notice it. And yet, none of that makes her story simple. Aki's influence was real, but so were her limits. She could guide men, but she could not remake the world that gave them more formal power than she would ever have. She could steady a room, but she could not keep every room safe. She could understand male vanity with extraordinary precision, but understanding it did not free her from having to live among it. Her strength was subtle, because subtlety was what her world allowed. Her control was indirect, because indirectness was often the only kind of control available to her. That is what makes her story worth remembering carefully. It is too easy to romanticize the geisha as a creature of beauty. It is too easy, too, to flatten her into a victim with no power at all. Aki was neither of those things. She lived in the difficult space between them. She learned how to survive by making men feel larger, calmer, smarter, and more desired than they might have felt elsewhere, while never forgetting that the room could turn on her if she misjudged the terms of that exchange. What looked from the outside like charm was often precision under pressure. What looked like effortless grace was often years of practice, vigilance, and self-control condensed into a single evening. So if we ask what Aki truly mastered, the answer is not simply beauty, or performance, or even men themselves. What she mastered was the unstable territory between power and dependence, between intimacy and distance, between making others feel safe and keeping something of herself intact inside that process. That was the geisha's psychological art, and that was why women like Aki could leave such a deep impression on men without ever needing to raise their voices, claim a title, or openly demand the authority they were already, in quieter ways, exercising. In the world of old Japan, that kind of power left no official trace. But inside the rooms where men revealed more of themselves than they'd intended, it was often the most important power there.